Imagine standing in front of thousands of screaming fans every single night, with the whole world completely convinced they knew everything about you. The cameras follow your every move. The newspapers print your face on their front pages. The entire country calls you their sweetheart and their national treasure. And yet, behind all of that noise and all of those bright lights, you are carrying a secret so heavy that it takes 29 full years before you finally feel ready to let it go. That is exactly the life that Sir Cliff Richard has been living quietly behind closed doors. And now, for the very first time, the full picture is finally starting to come together in a way that is shocking even his most devoted and loyal fans. For decades, Cliff Richard was the one celebrity that absolutely everybody thought they understood perfectly. He was the clean-cut gentleman of British pop music, the man who somehow never seemed to age, the star who stayed completely out of scandals when everyone around him was falling apart. He never got married. He never got caught up in the wild and destructive lifestyle that swallowed so many of his fellow stars whole. He just kept singing, kept smiling, and kept giving his fans everything they ever wanted. But here is the honest truth about a man who gives everyone around him everything they want. Sometimes the only way he can keep doing that is by keeping his real private life completely hidden from the rest of the world. And that is precisely what Cliff Richard did for 29 long years. He built a double life so carefully and so quietly that even the people closest to him had no idea what was really going on behind those closed doors. So stay right here with us, because what we are about to share today is going to completely change the way you see one of the most beloved entertainers who ever lived. Before we get into the secrets, we need to go back to where this remarkable story truly begins. Because you cannot understand the man Cliff Richard became without first understanding the boy he used to be. He was not born into fame or money. He came into this world as plain Harry Roger Webb, born on the 14th of October 1940 in the Indian city of Lucknow. His father Roger worked a steady job for the Indian Railways, and his mother Dorothy kept the whole family together lovingly at home. Harry grew up laughing and playing alongside his three sisters Joan, Jackie, and Donna in a household that felt genuinely safe and warm and full of love. But the world outside was changing fast in ways his family could not control. India was fighting hard for its independence, and the tension and violence that came with that struggle made it impossible for families like the Webbs to stay safely. In 1948, his parents made the heartbreaking decision to leave the only home they had ever known. They boarded a ship called the SS Ranchi and spent 3 long weeks crossing the ocean before arriving in England. For a boy who had grown up in warmth and sunshine, arriving in gray and rainy England was a genuine shock that hit him far harder than most people ever realized. The family settled into a simple house in Hertfordshire, where everything felt colder and harder than before. Harry worked hard at school and eventually got an ordinary job as a filing clerk, spending long days sorting papers while his mind was always somewhere else entirely, lost completely in the music he had come to love. Because Harry Webb had discovered music, and that discovery changed everything. His father bought him a guitar when he was just 16, and it was truly as if someone had handed him the one thing he had always been missing. He became completely obsessed with the skiffle craze sweeping through every school and youth club across England. He played in small bands wherever anyone would listen, and quickly understood that the name Harry Webb was never going to light up a big stage. In 1958, a man named Harry Greatorex suggested the name Cliff, saying it sounded solid and powerful like a great rock face standing firm against the sea. A brand new name was born, and with it came a destiny that nobody around him could have ever predicted. Cliff formed a band called the Drifters and signed his first record deal almost immediately. During his first recording session, the label bosses had planned to release a soft track called Schoolboy Crush. But when they all heard a completely different song called Move It, everything changed in one single moment. Move It shot straight to number 2 in the charts, and the British press went completely wild, calling him the British Elvis. He had the hip-swinging moves, the smoldering looks, and the raw energy that made teenage girls everywhere lose their minds. The band eventually changed their name to the Shadows because an American group already owned the Drifters' name. But that small change barely slowed Cliff down for even a single second of his incredible rise. Then, in 1964, something deeply important happened that shaped every single decision Cliff Richard would make for the rest of his life. He fully gave his heart to the Christian faith, and it was not quiet or private at all. It was total and completely genuine from the very first moment. At first, he seriously worried that his faith and his fame simply could not exist together, and he even considered walking away from pop music entirely to become a school teacher. But his close friends convinced him that God had not given him such a remarkable talent, just so he could throw it all away. In 1966, he stood bravely on stage alongside the great American preacher Billy Graham and told the entire watching world exactly and openly what he believed. It was a bold moment that could have ended his career, but instead defined it in a way that made him truly one of a kind among all the pop stars of his generation. He stayed far away from the drug-fueled chaos that destroyed so many artists in the 60s, and instead devoted himself to gospel albums and faith-based films. He gave the world beloved Christmas hits like Mistletoe and Wine and Savior's Day that became as much a part of British holiday tradition as mince pies and tinsel on the tree. He came heartbreakingly close to winning the Eurovision Song Contest in 1968 with the song Congratulations, losing by just one single point in a result many people firmly believe was influenced unfairly by outside political forces. He starred in wonderful films like The Young Ones and Summer Holiday, where he and his friends traveled joyfully across Europe in a cheerful big red double-decker bus full of laughter and music. He filled massive arenas decade after decade without ever losing his hold on the hearts of the British public. Then, in 1995, the Queen made him Sir Cliff Richard, the very first rock and roll star in the entire history of the United Kingdom to receive that deeply prestigious honor. But while all of that dazzling success was happening on the surface for the whole world to see, the story underneath was something completely different. And that is exactly where the double life truly begins. For all his warmth and charm in every interview he ever gave, there was always one topic Sir Cliff Richard kept tightly locked away: his romantic life. For decades, fans and journalists asked the very same burning question. Why had the most eligible bachelor in all of British pop music never gotten married? His public answer was always the same. His career was his true love, and the stage was his real home. But the full picture is far more complicated and heartbreaking than that neat answer could ever properly explain. Because Cliff Richard came very close to getting married more than once. And every single time, he chose his career over the woman standing right in front of him. In the early 60s, he met a beautiful young dancer named Delia Wicks at the famous London Palladium. She was just 20 years old, and Cliff was completely smitten from the very beginning. But even as his feelings for her grew, the realization that his rising fame was pulling him firmly in a different direction became impossible to ignore any longer. In one of the most painful moments of his entire private life, the young pop star sat down and wrote her a heartbreaking letter ending their relationship completely, so he could focus entirely on becoming the legend he believed he was meant to be. That letter devastated Delia deeply and haunted Cliff quietly for many long years afterward. Then there was Jackie Irving, a strikingly beautiful 19-year-old dancer he spent an unforgettable summer with in Blackpool. They were practically inseparable during that warm and happy time, and Cliff actually walked directly into his manager's office one day and asked very seriously whether marrying Jackie would cost him fans. When his manager told him he could expect to lose around a third of his entire audience, Cliff ended the relationship immediately without ever looking back. He later told the story openly to television host Piers Morgan, and Piers was genuinely stunned by what he heard. He called Cliff ruthless and asked directly how any man could make such a cold and calculated decision about his own heart. Cliff defended himself by saying that if he had truly been deeply in love, no number of lost fans would have stopped him. But that explanation did little to remove the uncomfortable image of a man perfectly willing to sacrifice another person's heart for the sake of protecting his own fame. And then there was Sue Barker, the hugely popular tennis champion and well-loved television presenter, whom Cliff began dating in the 1980s after confidently tracking down her phone number and inviting her to one of his concerts. They spent a wonderful summer together during the Wimbledon season and exchanged long, warm phone calls and sweet telegrams whenever they were far apart. Sue has said openly that she enjoyed her time with Cliff and found him kind and fun and genuinely attentive. But the constant attention from newspaper photographers began driving her to breaking point, and the 16-year age gap between them worried her family very deeply. Things gradually cooled between them, and in a move that left Sue feeling particularly dismissed, Cliff reportedly sent a friend to call her and deliver the news that their romance was over. What really hurt Sue came much later. Cliff began telling reporters repeatedly that he had seriously considered proposing to her, but held back simply because he was not quite in love enough to commit his whole life. Sue, who had long since happily married and moved on completely, was absolutely furious. She wrote plainly in her published book that if she had ever known a few casual months of dating would still be brought up in public interviews 40 years later, she would never have gone anywhere near him. She felt Cliff had wildly exaggerated what she had always seen as nothing more than a pleasant and light friendship between two busy people going in different directions. Beyond the romances, Cliff spent nearly 3 decades managing a living arrangement that the press found endlessly mysterious. For much of his adult life, he shared his home with his longtime trusted manager Bill Latham and Bill's family, creating a warm and stable household that gave him the freedom to pour himself entirely into his music and faith. But because this arrangement looked nothing like what people expected a famous bachelor's life to look like, the whispers and rumors started almost immediately and never really stopped. For decades, persistent rumors swirled about whether Cliff might secretly be gay. He always denied this calmly and without anger, simply pointing out that a man choosing not to chase after every woman he met was not saying anything revealing about his true private nature. He refused firmly to get married just to silence the gossip, calling that idea dishonest and disrespectful toward something he personally considered genuinely sacred. He knew the truth about himself, and his real friends knew it too, and eventually he made his peace with the fact that people on the outside would always believe whatever they personally wanted regardless of anything he said. But then came the truly dark and devastating moment that threatened to pull everything crashing completely down around him. In 2014, a serious and frightening situation descended on Sir Cliff Richard's life, unlike anything he had ever faced before. A grave accusation emerged publicly claiming he had committed a sexual offense against a 15-year-old boy at a religious gathering in Sheffield back in 1985. Shortly after, 4 more men came forward with separate allegations covering a period from the late 50s through to the 80s. The Crown Prosecution Service launched a full formal investigation. Cliff declared his complete innocence from the very first moment and never once wavered from that position throughout the entire painful ordeal. Every case was eventually dropped because there was simply not enough credible evidence to support any of the claims, and he was never arrested or charged with a single crime. But the damage done during that investigation cut far deeper than any legal clearance could fix. The police search of his private home was filmed and broadcast live on national television before anyone had even spoken to him directly about the allegations. Cliff watched footage of his own home being searched on the evening news, just like any ordinary member of the public, and the profound humiliation of that moment stayed painfully with him long after the cameras had moved on. He later described lying awake night after night, consumed by a hatred so fierce toward his unknown accuser that he frightened himself with the power of those dark feelings. The relentless stress began attacking his body from within, triggering painful outbreaks of shingles, so severe that the blisters crept dangerously close to his eyes, and his own doctor warned him seriously that he risked going permanently blind. He took the BBC to court over their decision to broadcast that search so publicly and prematurely, and he won, securing an important ruling that helped change how people accused of serious crimes are treated by the media before formal charges are ever brought. He became a passionate and vocal supporter of changing the existing law so that no innocent person would ever again be forced to endure the same devastating public humiliation he had barely survived. It remains a cause born entirely from his own suffering, and he has never once stopped speaking out loudly for it since that day. And then, just as the world had settled comfortably back into its view of Cliff Richard as the unbreakable national treasure he had always been, came the personal revelation that finally filled in the last remaining piece of the double life he had been carefully managing for nearly 3 full decades. In a deeply emotional television conversation with former broadcaster Dermot Murnaghan, who was himself bravely facing a stage for cancer diagnosis at that very time, Sir Cliff Richard chose to reveal openly to the world that he had been secretly battling early-stage prostate cancer completely alone, without telling a single soul around him. He was 84 years old when he finally made this deeply personal news public. The cancer had been discovered entirely by accident during a routine medical check required by his insurance company ahead of his planned 2024 tour of Australia and New Zealand. His doctors had caught it before it had any chance to spread, and with treatment he came successfully through it. But while he had been outwardly preparing with excitement to perform for tens of thousands of fans on the other side of the world, he had been quietly living with the terrifying knowledge that a dangerous tumor was growing silently inside his body that nobody around him knew anything about. He spoke with remarkable and moving honesty about everything the experience had taught him, saying plainly that men everywhere carry a dangerous habit of believing they are somehow invincible, when the simple truth is that every one of them is just as fragile and vulnerable as everyone else. He urged every man listening to stop waiting and get tested without any further delay, saying with complete conviction that the only reason he was still standing healthy on a stage today was because a routine check had found exactly what it needed to find at precisely the right moment. He called passionately on the government to launch a proper national screening program for prostate cancer, and said without hesitation that he was completely ready to stand publicly alongside King Charles, who had recently spoken bravely about his own cancer journey, to fight as loudly and as hard as necessary for that vital and life-saving cause. That willingness to turn his own private fear into something that might save other people is perhaps the single most honest thing the unraveling of Sir Cliff Richard's double life has brought into the open. Because behind every carefully managed secret and every quietly maintained private arrangement and every romance that ended before it could properly grow, there was always a man giving far more of himself than anyone watching from the outside could ever fully see. He gave millions quietly to charitable causes throughout his entire career without ever seeking recognition. He traveled personally to Uganda and Brazil to stand on the ground and see exactly what his generosity was doing for real people living in real poverty. He raised vital funds for the children's hospital that saved the life of his tiny nephew Philip, who had spent the first 4 frightening months of his life fighting for every single breath. He dedicated years to supporting Alzheimer's Research UK after watching his own dear mother slowly disappear into that heartless disease. He built a tennis foundation that helped more than 200,000 young children across the country get active and healthy through sport. The double life of Sir Cliff Richard turned out to be nothing like what anyone had ever imagined or whispered about. It was not dark or dishonest or built on anything selfish or cruel. It was simply the quiet and purposeful life of a man who decided very early on that the best way he could love the world was to stand on a stage every night and pour his whole heart into singing for it, and then do everything else he cared about with complete silence and genuine humility on his very own terms. He gave up the dream of a traditional family life. He survived devastating false accusations that nearly broke his spirit. He faced a secret illness with quiet courage while still smiling warmly for every camera pointed his way. And through every single hard and painful moment, he kept giving everything he had to the people around him and the causes that truly mattered without ever asking for credit or expecting applause for anything happening away from the spotlight. That is the true and complete secret of Sir Cliff Richard. And now that it has finally come fully into the light, it turns out to be one of the most quietly beautiful and genuinely moving stories that British pop music has ever had the privilege of telling. What is your most treasured personal memory of Sir Cliff Richard? Drop it in the comments below and share it with all of us. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, share it with someone who loves classic British music, and subscribe so you never miss a single story from us. And please tap on the next video on your screen right now, because we genuinely promise you are going to love it.